Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast alternates between an Unpacking Scholarship episode, where I unpack some scholarship in relation to CS education, and an episode where I interview a guest or multiple guests. This week's episode is an Unpacking Scholarship episode where I continue a little mini-series on gender. In particular, I'm going to unpack a paper by Judith Butler titled Performative Acts and Gender Constitution, an essay in phenomenology and feminist theory. This paper was published in the Theater Journal in 1988. If I were to summarize this particular paper into a single sentence, I would say that this seminal paper unpacks the notion that gender is a performative act that is socially and historically constructed. So here's actually the final couple of sentences in the paper itself. This is from page 531. And it summarizes much of what I'm about to talk about. Quote, "Gender is not passively scripted on the body, and neither is it determined by nature, language, the symbolic, or the overwhelming history of patriarchy. Gender is what is put on, invariably, under constraint, daily and incessantly, with anxiety and pleasure. But if this continuous act is mistaken for a natural or linguistic given, power is relinquished to expand the cultural field bodily through subversive performances of various kinds." End quote. Okay, so this particular paper begins with an introduction that unpacks what it means to become a woman, or to become a gender. So here's a quote from page 519 through 520. Now it's a long quote, but I'm going to kind of rephrase it after I state it. Quote, "When Simone de Beauvoir claims one is not born, but rather becomes a woman, she is appropriating and reinterpreting this doctrine of constituting acts from the phenomenological tradition. In this sense, gender is no way a stable identity or locus of agency from which various acts proceed. Rather, it is an identity tenuously constituted in time, an identity instituted through a stylized repetition of acts. Further, gender is instituted through the stylization of the body, and hence, must be understood as the mundane way in which bodily gestures, movements, and enactments of various kinds constitute the illusion of an abiding gendered self. This formulation moves the conception of gender off the ground of a substantial model of identity to one that requires a conception of a constituted social temporality. Significantly, if gender is instituted through acts which are internally discontinuous, then the appearance of substance is precisely that, a constructed identity, a performative accomplishment which the mundane social audience, including the actors themselves, come to believe and to perform in the mode of belief. If the ground of gender identity is a stylized repetition of acts through time, and not a seemingly seamless identity, then the possibilities of gender transformation are to be found in the arbitrary relation between such acts, in the possibility of a different sort of repeating, in the breaking or subversive repetition of that style." End quote. Okay, so that was a long quote, but given that this is an article written for a theater journal, talking about acting and actors and performing, think of it through that lens of gender is a role or a character that you are taking on and performing within a play. In this case, this play is in society. So you are trying to adhere to a particular role that has been set historically for you. Someone has given you the script, and you are having to learn how to act out that script. So it is socially constructed and historically constructed through those who have acted out the gender roles before you and continue to act them out with and against you in society. So a little bit further down on page 520, here's a quote. Quote, "What is called gender identity is a performative accomplishment compelled by social sanction and taboo." End quote. Okay, so if we think of this as what is a social sanction and taboo? A gender identity, you are performing your identity, however you identify, whether you identify as non-binary, as male, female, however you identify. Whatever you do to perform that identity will either receive some kind of affirmation or support from others, or somebody might look at it and go, that's not how you're supposed to behave as a blank gender identity. Okay, so the rest of the paper is going to kind of unpack this stuff that's been talked about in this very first introduction. So the first main section of this paper after intro is called Sex, Gender, Feminist and Phenomenological Views. And by the way, there's a slash between sex and gender. So the main gist of the opening part of this particular part of the paper is that feminists have argued that sex and gender are two different things. So sex being biological and gender being social. So here's a quote from page 520. Quote, In distinguishing sex from gender, feminist theorists have disputed causal explanations that assumes that sex dictates or necessitates certain social meanings for women's experience, end quote. And Butler goes on to argue that this construction of a gender, such as a woman, as a man, or I'll add in the term non-binary, is historically situated and culturally situated. So depending on where you live, the communities that you live in, and the histories of those communities and how they view different types of gender, there might be different variants on roles that you play. So let's say you identify as a woman. Within a particular culture, there are going to be certain social norms or expectations of what it means to act as a woman within that particular culture. However, if you take that sort of behavior and the sort of performative role, and then put it into another completely different culture, maybe on the other side of the world, there are a different set of norms and expectations that when you try and enact what you think it means to be a woman, they might look at you and go, that's not how a woman is supposed to act around here. And again, this applies to any kind of gender identity. So in other words, the social views or norms or expectations for an identity, such as a gender identity, is situated within that culture, and it is influenced by historical acts, behaviors, laws, etc. All right, so I'm going to read another quote. This is from page 521, and apologies if I mispronounce this name. Quote, Merleau-Ponty maintains not only that the body is an historical idea, but a set of possibilities to be continually realized. In claiming that the body is an historical idea, Merleau-Ponty means that it gains its meaning through a concrete and historically mediated expression in the world. That the body is a set of possibilities signifies A, that its appearance in the world, for perception, is not predetermined by some manner of interior essence, and B, that its concrete expression in the world must be understood as the taking up and rendering specific of a set of historical possibilities, end quote. So in other words, that the ways that your body appears in the world is not some innate thing that is predetermined by what Butler refers to as an interior essence, and that if we look at this from a theatrical standpoint, we are actors who are performing a specific set of historical identities that have been predetermined for us. So here's a quote from page 521 and 522. Quote, to do, to dramatize, to reproduce, these seem to be some of the elementary structures of embodiment. This doing of gender is not merely a way in which embodied agents are exterior, surfaced, open to the perception of others. Embodiment clearly manifests a set of strategies, or what Sartre would perhaps have called a style of being, or Foucault, a stylistics of existence. This style is never fully self-styled, for living styles have a history, and that history conditions and limits possibilities. Consider gender, for instance, as a corporal style, an act, as it were, which is both intentional and performative, where performative itself carries the double meaning of dramatic and non-referential, end quote. So apologies if I mispronounced Sartre, S-A-R-T-R-E. Now, because Butler considers gender to be a performance, quote, those who fail to do their gender right are regularly punished, end quote. It's from page 522. Quote, gender is thus a construction that regularly conceals its genesis. The tacit collective agreement to perform, produce, and sustain discrete and polar genders are culturally fictions, as cultural fictions is obscured by the credibility of its own production. The authors of gender become entranced by their own fictions, whereby the construction compels one's belief in its necessity and naturalness. The historical possibilities materialized through various corporal styles are nothing other than those punitively regulated cultural fictions that are alternatively embodied and disguised under duress, end quote. It's from page 522. So we, socially, are going off of the historical constructions of what it means to be blank identity, and we then are furthering that by performing that identity, by buying into the narrative that is written before us, historically, and is being co-written by us socially in the world that we are in. So if you identify as a man, the ways that you behave, the ways that you dress, the words that you use, how you carry your body, the acts that you do, the hobbies that you have, all of those things fit within certain historical and socially constructed expectations around what it means to identify as a man. And in the last few decades, but more recently in the last decade or so, there have been discussions in the US, in particular, about people who are born with a sex that does not match their gender identity, and people are resisting that somebody is going against what society is telling them they should be, based off of their sex. So if somebody is born as a man, and they identify as a woman, then they take on these gendered roles related to being a woman. And some people do not understand that process and what it means to perform these kinds of identities. And so there's been a lot of random discussions around bathrooms and pronouns and all sorts of other random stuff. While as a non-binary individual, I find a lot of the discussions and assumptions problematic, I like that we're actually having some kind of a dialogue about it, as opposed to not talking about it. So as uncomfortable as those discussions are, and as uncomfortable as like this podcast is to try and frame things in a way that can be understood by people who agree with me and also disagree with me, I think these kind of discussions are important, which is why I'm bringing this particular episode to this little mini-series that's on gender. Butler's paper is seminal. It is a very important paper to talk about in relation to CS and CS education, and I'll have some questions towards the end of this episode that unpack it more. I want to dive deeper into Butler's notion of performativity. So here's a quote from page 523. Quote, "My suggestion is that the body becomes its gender through a series of acts which are renewed, revised, and consolidated through time. From a feminist point of view, one might try to reconceive the gendered body as the legacy of sedimented acts rather than a predetermined or foreclosed structure, essence or fact, whether natural, cultural, or linguistic." End quote. Again, going back to the discussion on trans individuals, non-binary individuals, etc., this kind of discourse helps shed light on the idea that people who do not identify as cisgendered, so in other words, a person whose gender aligns with the sex that was assigned at birth. So for example, if on your birth certificate it says that you were male and you identify as male, then that person is a cis male. Now, if as myself, my sex was assigned at birth as male, but I do not agree with that assignment in terms of my gender, I fall within the trans community in terms of not being aligned with between the gender and the sex that was assigned at birth. So I personally identify as non-binary. However, there are many different types of other genders outside of the male-female binary that exist within the trans umbrella, like genderqueer, trans, non-binary, gender fluid, etc. There's many more. Now, as Butler is saying, it is through this series of acts within social contexts that our gender identities are renewed, revised, and consolidated through time. It is through these experimentations over time that we continue to get to know and better understand our identities, or even bear witness to the changes in identities over time, such as a gender fluid individual. Now, one of the interesting quotes that's from page 523 is, quote, "One ought to consider the futility of a political program which seeks radically to transform the social situations of women without first determining whether the category of woman is socially constructed in such a way that to be a woman is, by definition, to be in an oppressed situation." End quote. Now, I'm going to unpack this a little bit more towards the end of this particular podcast, so keep that in the back of your mind. So the second section of this paper is titled Binary Genders and the Heterosexual Contract. Now, in this paper, Butler begins by talking about how by putting genders into binaries and making it, quote, natural to have male and female genders attracted to each other, it ostracizes anything outside of the heteronormative lens that is being used in these social acts or dialogues or discourses. So in other words, it's basically saying, if you do not fit within male and female, or if you do not fit within a male-female relationship, then you are other, or less than, or an outsider, or different. Now, thankfully, since this paper was initially written in 1988, there have been a lot of changes socially, policy-wise, etc., that have helped dispel this notion of the false binary and the heteronormative lens that is frequently used in discourse within the US. However, we're still having to fight for rights for people who exist outside of the binary and people who do not fall within a heterosexual relationship. Now, further in this section, Butler describes how we as individuals are acting within social norms. And if, as it was in relatively recent time, if people were not able to express their gender and sexuality within social settings, this sets the precedent or the unspoken understanding that it is not okay to identify outside of what is considered to be the norm. So to be more explicit with what I'm saying, if we think of how individuals who are not heterosexual had to hide their sexuality publicly and had to engage in sexual acts and relationships and romance outside of the public eye because it was considered to be not a part of the accepted performance of what it means to be in a relationship or to have a sexuality. Tying it back into gender, people within the trans community have had to hide in the US their identities because it does not fit within what was considered to be the norm in the US. Here's a quote from page 526. Quote, "When this conception of social performance is applied to gender, it is clear that although there are individual bodies that enact these significations by becoming stylized into gendered modes, this action is immediately public as well. There are temporal and collective dimensions to these actions, and their public nature is not inconsequential. Indeed, the performance is effected with the strategic aim of maintaining gender within its binary frame. Understood in pedagogical terms, the performance renders social laws explicit." End quote. So if we think about this particular quote and what I was just rambling about, this gets at the idea of why representation is important. So for example, if we do not see certain identities within certain careers, like computer science, by having media such as posters and videos and curricula created to include a diverse range of identities, then we might be implicitly stating certain kinds of identities are welcome within computer science while others are not. So if you listen to the episode 2 weeks ago that talked about how course materials can be gendered and forward a certain notion that certain genders are acceptable within computer science while others are not, this can be highly problematic. So we as educators need to think through, how are we acting out genders and what identities, not just gender, but any identities, are we encouraging and enabling within the resources and projects and experiences that we design, facilitate, teach, whatever, in computer science education. Again, the performance renders social laws explicit. So if we have projects that are 100% male, or 100% involve heterosexual relationships, or 100% involve only white individuals, all of these are performing those social laws that say that this is accepted while other things are not. Whether we intend that or not, that's how it can be perceived by students, by community members, etc. So if you haven't listened to the episode that I did 2 weeks ago, make sure you take a listen to that. And the following episodes are going to unpack this a little bit more, and one of the examples is actually going to talk about how some of these gender norms are different in other countries. So stay tuned for upcoming episodes. Now, not only is representation important, but it's also important to understand that there are social expectations involved with different identities and how we perform those identities. Now, here's a quote from page 528, and if you've listened to the Unpacking Scholarship episodes that talk about Paulo Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, think of this in relation to lenses, not just relation to gender, but other forms of oppression related to identities that I talk about in those other episodes, which I'll link to in the show notes. This is from page 528. Quote, "Genders, then, can be neither true nor false, neither real nor apparent. And yet, one is compelled to live in a world in which genders constitute unequivocal signifiers, in which gender is stabilized, polarized, rendered discrete, and intractable. In effect, gender is made to comply with a model of truth and falsity which not only contradicts its own performative fluidity, but serves a social policy of gender regulation and control. Performing one's gender wrong initiates a set of punishments both obvious and indirect, and performing it well provides the reassurance that there is an essentialism of gender identity after all. That this reassurance is so easily displaced by anxiety, that culture so readily punishes or marginalizes those who fail to perform the illusion of gender essentialism, should be sign enough that on some level there is social knowledge that the truth or falsity of gender is only socially compelled and in no sense ontologically necessitated." End quote. Okay, so some concrete examples of this. As an example, before I found the terminology to identify as non-binary, in high school I shaved my legs, which, as somebody who was male presenting, was not socially acceptable, and needless to say, led to a lot of interesting commentary by my peers. As another example, think of what might happen if a very masculine-looking individual were to start wearing a dress. Cut that. The ways in which people respond to seeing that expression of gender identity can reaffirm that there are correct and incorrect ways to fit within a particular identity. And that internal dialogue of a person who internally does not fit with the identity that society has prescribed them can cause a lot of harm mentally, physically, socially, emotionally, etc. to an individual. So for example, if you have a student who identifies outside of the sex that was assigned to them at birth, depending on the community that they're in and their peers, or you as a teacher, or other administrators, or other family members and community members, depending on how you structure that social environment, can have a huge positive or negative impact on that student. This doesn't just apply to gender identity, but any type of identity. So it's something that we as educators really need to consider. And I've got some questions at the end that I'm still thinking through, and I think the field should also think through, that I'll share here pretty soon. Before I do that, I just want to say that there is one final section in here that is called Feminist Theory Beyond an Expressive Model of Gender. And I've already read one quote related to that at the start of this podcast, and I will read one more very shortly. Okay, so as always in these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I just want to share some lingering questions or thoughts that I have while reading this particular paper. The first one that I have is, when are we unintentionally reaffirming gender expectations and binaries through performative acts related to CS education? So for example, if you listen to the interview with Sarah Judd, which I'll include a link to in the show notes, Sarah talks about how in the computer science classes that they're in school, in the K-12 setting, had these notions of what it meant to be a female in CS. It had these preconceived notions of what it meant to be a female or woman in computer science education, interested in it. So it came with assumptions like, oh, well, if you identify as a girl, then you like to help people, and you like to have things with rainbows and ponies in it, and you don't like to talk about nerdy things like Star Wars, etc. So depending on how we set up our classroom environment and the ways that we communicate with the students that we work with and the assumptions that we make in terms of, oh, you are blank gender identity, therefore you must like blah blah blah, those assumptions can reaffirm gender expectations and binaries through the performative acts that we are doing while teaching. So it's something to consider, not only in relation to gender, but other identities as well. To use some verbiage from some academic discourse, we are essentializing, or engaging in a process of cultural essentialization, where we are taking an identity and saying, you are X identity, therefore you must think Y and Z, without actually getting to know children as individuals. So the next question that I have is, how do we balance between finding solidarity within a marginalized identity and challenging the social construction of that identity? So here's a quote that is from page 530. Quote, "Certainly, it remains politically important to represent women, but to do that in a way that does not distort and reify the very collectivity the theory is supposed to emancipate." End quote. So in other words, yes, it's important to organize and find solidarity within marginalized identities. However, we have to understand that it is not a unified identity, and we should in some way try and challenge the construction or apparent unification of that identity. So an example that a professor used in a class that I took was going through a process of centering, decentering, and recentering. So one way to describe this might be to center around a particular identity. So, for example, myself getting to know and understand my perspective as a non-binary individual, and finding others who identify similarly with their gender identity. Decentering might be trying to find other identities, perspectives, ways of being that exist outside of my own, to try and better understand many different perspectives and voices around gender. Recentering is then the process of coming back to myself and going, now that I've learned all these other things, how do I better understand, or how have my own identity around gender changed through this process of centering, decentering, and recentering? So one way we can do this in CS education is to potentially create personalized projects that get to know individuals. So for example, an interactive collage in Scratch. You could create this as a process of centering, where you are creating a collage that expresses who you are in that moment. You could then go through a series of projects that decenter around other identities outside of that collage. So if you identify as somebody who likes sports, and somebody who likes painting, and somebody who likes to read, you could then try and find some different perspectives or hobbies or identities or whatever outside of that and learn about it and create some projects around that. That would be a decentering process. Then a recentering process or project might be coming back and saying, okay, how can I take this new understanding, new ways of being that I now better understand, and reassess my own identity? And you engage in this process in a cyclical nature. So you're constantly centering, decentering, recentering. Now, I will say, as a student, at the time I was a grad student, when I went through this process, Many of these students in that particular class felt it was unstabilizing going through this process and difficult because it was constantly going, well, I thought I had this solid understanding of who I am as an individual, and now I'm realizing that one, there may have been some problematic assumptions that I was making, and two, that identity is not as firm as I thought it was. It's actually fluid and ever-changing, etc. So just a heads up in advance, if you as an individual, or the classes that you work with, decide to go through this process of centering, decentering, recentering, it can be a little unnerving or destabilizing going through this process of examining your identities. But it is a very worthwhile process, in my opinion. All right, so the final question that I have for this particular paper has an embedded quote in it from page 527. So if, quote, gender reality is performative, which means, quite simply, that it is real only to the extent that it is performed, end quote, what other identities besides gender might we consider as performative and in need of discussing as a field? So sticking with gender, if gender is a construction, socially, and it is something that is performed, how can we challenge the notion of that construction and dive deeper in CS research, education, policy, discourse, etc.? But what other identities might be performative in nature and that we as a field need to discuss? Thankfully, as a field, we're starting to discuss race more. We're starting to discuss individuals with disabilities, whether physical, neurological, etc. But what other identities are potentially performative and that we should be discussing as a field? And I'm not saying we shouldn't discuss the things that we already are. We certainly need to do that. It's a yes and approach that I think that we as a field need to kind of figure out. The point is, who is missing from this conversation? What identities are we not discussing as a field? And how can we engage in a reflective process, similar to what I discussed in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed miniseries, where we are trying to examine from lenses oppressor and oppressed to figure out who's missing from this conversation and how are they being impacted by this. All right, so those are my lingering questions or thoughts for this particular paper. I know this publication and the things that I've talked about might take some time to digest because these are not simple conversations to have, but I hope this helped you walk away with some questions or considerations or thoughts that you might be able to take into the physical or virtual classrooms that you are working with. If you want to read this paper itself, I will include a link to it in the show notes. And I will continue this little mini-series on gender with a discussion on a study that has to do with gender and computer science education in 2 weeks. So stay tuned next week for another interview, and 2 weeks from now for another Unpacking Scholarship episode. Thank you so much for taking time to listen to this episode. I hope you all have a wonderful week and are staying safe.